as we let the darkness take control. The man who told me about his terrifying experience in the Colorado wilderness is one of those distant relatives that everyone has. They're your third cousin twice removed, or something to that effect. I'm not positive how exactly we're related, but he is an incredible guy. Greg is a decorated Green Beret with a silver star to his name that he earned by capturing the leader of an Afghan sniper cell without incurring any casualties. Despite his status as a huge badass and his not unconsiderable size of 6'3" and 200 pounds, Greg is a teddy bear. He is an extremely humble and kind person. I've had a lot of experiences in the outdoors, having lived in Colorado for most of my life, and Greg and I have had extended conversations about our adventures in the woods at my grandma's house for Thanksgiving. We were sitting on the couch, wearing tacky holiday sweaters, when the conversation turned to hunting. Greg mentioned offhandedly that he used to be an avid hunter, but had an experience that turned him off it. He said he doesn't even like guns anymore, something I found surprising coming from such an accomplished soldier. I pushed him to tell me what happened, and thought he seemed uncomfortable with the idea, but he finally relented and did tell me. I'm going to switch this to first person now, to tell it to you in the same way that Greg told this story to me. It was late October, which means elk season up in Indian Peaks Wilderness, and I went up there to bag a few elk, and just relax for a few days by myself. I parked the truck near a trailhead about 8 miles from where I wound up setting up camp, and was looking forward to a nice weekend in the woods with some peace and quiet after packing all my gear in and getting ready. The first morning, I was in my deer blind, about 20 feet up a tree, with a cup of coffee and my rifle. The sun had just come up about an hour ago. About 50 yards from my tree, the tree line ended and opened into this big meadow where a lot of the elk tended to roll through, and I could sight my rifle pretty well through the trees and see most of this big grassy area. Perhaps a couple of hours had passed, which isn't really boring in the deep woods. I just drank coffee from my thermos and listened to all the life around me, feeling the woods getting ready for winter. I couldn't believe my luck when I glanced over at the meadow and saw a large group of elk had started grazing in the meadow. The silent animals plodded along, oblivious to me watching. Among the group was one of the most beautiful elk I had ever seen. It's what was called a monarch, which means it had antlers with 8 points each, something really rare. I quietly clicked the safety of my rifle and sighted it. When you're hunting an animal like this, you want to put a bullet right where the skull meets the spine, in order to sever the spinal column and kill it instantly and painlessly. The focus, when you get it in the zone, is incredible. I swear I could feel the firing pin punch forward, and the bullet would leave the barrel as I pulled the trigger. That beautiful elk went down silently, and all the others scattered for the tree line. I was ecstatic about the shot and the elk as I climbed down out of the blind and set off for the meadow. I had left my rifle in my blind, something I regretted soon, and had only my small knife on me to gut the animal and drag it back to camp. As I was making the short walk between my blind and the meadow, I noticed that the woods around me were completely silent. Some of this is normal after you fire a gun in the woods, but for it to drag on this long was unsettling. I thought nothing of it, and continued to walk the short walk through the dense pines, as I was about to clear the trees and step into the meadow. I noticed something odd. I could see the elk's body lying in the grass through the trees, but there was something else. There was what looked like another elk, antlers and all, on the opposite side of the dead elk from where I was coming to walk out of the tree line, almost looking as though it were gently nuzzling the elk's dead body. This was weird, to see an elk treat a dead elk like this. They usually scatter, but I continued walking towards it, trapezing in the duff and hollering in an attempt to startle this other elk off. It snapped its head and looked up at me. Over the body of its fallen friend, this strange new elk eyed me with an unafraid glare. I say glare because it didn't feel like an animal looking at me anymore. Its glassy black eyes gave me the same caught, red-handed feeling that you got when your parents would catch you doing something wrong. I felt suddenly uncomfortable and out of place in the woods that I loved so much, and somehow hated and guilty. I no longer wanted the elk, and I stopped dead in my tracks and watched this animal, and it eyed me angrily. What it did next gives me nightmares to this day. The thing that stood before me on the other side of the dead elk must have been lying on its stomach, and it put its arms down and pushed up, putting its legs underneath it. It reared back, glaring at me, along with its evil glass eyes. My breath caught in my throat. Most of its body was at least somewhat human, but terribly emaciated and elongated. It appeared to stand at least 10 feet tall, not including the antlers atop of the elk's head. It was bald everywhere but the neck up. It looked stickly pale and pink. Its legs at the knee bent backwards, like the back legs of an elk. This horrible, skinny, naked, unnatural thing just stood there, glowering at me, with a hatred that was palpable. The woods around us was silent. It might have been a second, minute, or hours. I felt the disapproving parent feeling shift. I felt more like an ant under a shoe. I took a step back. My boots felt 10 pounds. My body felt numb, and the noise of my footstep was ear-splitting. I took one more, and then ran. Running through thick woods is tough, but I ran faster than I have ran in my life. I passed under my blind with my $4,000 rifle sitting in it, without even slowing down. I ran all the way back to my camp, which must have been a mile, before I stopped and took my breath. It took me another minute to dare to look behind me. I was alone, but the woods around me were still silent and brooding. I wanted more than anything to pack up and go home, but I knew that I could not make it back to the car before nightfall, and I didn't want to be exposed at night. I cooked an MRE in my tent and stayed there for the rest of the night. When night fell, I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and tried to sleep, but I couldn't stop myself from starting at every little noise. I kept thinking about possible rational explanations for what I saw. Maybe there's a crazy guy out there who found an elk head and is wearing it around scaring people, but no explanation I came up with quelled the maddening feeling of fear that I felt, the horrible sense of being hated and guilty and far from home. And nothing explained why that thing was 10 feet tall with inverted knees. As soon as the sun came up, I ran back to the blind and took it down. Then, I ran back to camp with my rifle and pack, packed everything up, and hiked out. I've never fired a gun in the woods since, and I don't intend to ever again. I'm not a spiritual person, but if that wasn't something in the forest telling me to leave it alone, I don't know what is. I can take a hint. I don't think I'll ever know exactly what that creature was, but I know what I saw. Next time you're up in the woods alone, Be quiet, be respectful, and don't kill anything that you don't have to. I thought at first that Greg's story was too far-fetched to be true, but as he told it, I saw how truly scared he was. This confident, softly spoken military man was stuttering through his story, hands shaking and face pale. I still don't know what to make of it, but the area he said it occurred is one I'm quite familiar with, and it can be an eerie place. Sometimes, being alone in the woods can feel like anything but. It just might be that there's some force out there, some inhuman creature who guards the woods. Just in case, I take extra care to be respectful whenever I'm among nature. You never know who could be watching. Against the advice of my parents, I started working at a bikini coffee stand when I was 17 years old, and continued working there until I was 20. If you're unfamiliar with bikini coffee stands, they are little drive-through espresso stands, usually painted in some neon colour, where all the employees wear lingerie or bikinis while they serve coffee. I know this sounds strange, and believe me, it is strange. However, the money was good, and it was fun at the time. Not to mention my parents really couldn't afford to pay for college. There is no loudspeaker where customers place their order. They simply drive up to the stand, order coffee, and make small talk as they oogle you in your skimpy ensemble. Within a matter of months, the boss gave me the busiest shift. The shift began at 4 AM and ended at 9:30 AM. Though the coffee stand was not officially open until 4:30. I had to count the till, grind the espresso beans, fill up the sinks, and take stocks, clean if needed, etc. The coffee stand was situated in the corner of a large parking lot, sharing the enormous empty lot with only one other retailer. This retailer didn't even open until around 10 AM, and so I arrived to the lot when it was completely dark, save for one dim street lamp above the stand, and the other in the far corner of the lot. I pulled up to the stand as I normally did, only this time it was my first shift alone. Normally I worked with one other girl, as this shift would get far too busy for one person. I had a routine with regular customers, as I literally worked every single day, as the boss wouldn't give time off unless requested. While I worked, I would see cars approach the stand, and know immediately which drink to prepare, based on my recognition of a regular customer's vehicle. After almost a year on the morning shift, it was rare to see a new vehicle, or meet a new customer. My boss was extremely strict about being fast and efficient, and would have us prepare drinks in advance for our regulars whilst they waited in the line of cars. My boss was so strict that for the first 6 months of my working there, he would watch constantly on his camera system and call me on the business phone to scream at me for lack of efficiency. After this, I became so fast at preparing drinks, I decided he guessed he would save money by having me work alone in the very early morning hours. So, like normal, I approached the stand and punched in the access code. I went inside and turned on some music right away to keep myself company. The street lamp directly above the coffee stand had burnt out a few days before, so it was rather dark outside. Coupled with the tinted sliding windows of the coffee stand and the knowledge that I was completely alone, I felt a little creeped out, though not nearly as creeped out and terrified as I would be in a few minutes. Even though the stand was technically open at 4:30, I wouldn't expect my first customer until about 4:45. I usually arrived at 4, but since it was my first shift alone, I came in at 3:30 to give myself enough time to complete all of the opening tasks. My first customer was always Dave. He drove a red sports car and ordered a double cappuccino heavy on the foam. He worked for the local Boeing plant and would brag about his high-ranking job in between awkward remarks about my body. You get used to that sort of thing after a while, but nothing could prepare me for this sort of thing that happened to me on that particular dark morning. Though many of our customers were pervy men like Dave, most of the early morning customers weren't as lecherous as one would expect. They simply needed coffee, and no other businesses were open as early as we. In fact, many of our morning customers were married women in soccer mum vans in desperate need of caffeine. I glanced up at the clock as I counted the money in the till. 3:50 a.m. I finished the count and walked from the back of the stand onto the main floor. There were 2 steps separating the back of the stand from the main floor. The back of the stand had no windows and contained a bathroom, large refrigerator, washer and dryer, etc. This is the area that my co-workers and myself would get ready and joke around where customers couldn't see us. As soon as we walked onto the main floor where customers could see us, uniform was required. Lingerie or bikini as well as heels. That morning I was wearing a matching pink lingerie set with knit stockings. The lingerie fully covered my breasts and buttocks and provided more coverage than a typical bikini that you would see at a beach. I counted all of the syrup bottles. I opened the fridge and took stock inside. I turned on the espresso grinder and robotically poured in a bag of espresso beans. I started filling up the large commercial sink with soapy water, and the music played softly on the stereo. Then I heard it over the noise of the faucet, coffee grinder and the music. I wasn't sure I heard anything at first, so I just ignored it. But then I heard it again. Someone was tapping on the sliding glass window of the stand. I wiped off my wet hands and grabbed my cell phone. 4:15. We weren't open for another 15 minutes. I checked the light switches to make sure I didn't accidentally flip on the open sign. Along with the open sign, the stand was equipped with bright floodlights to illuminate the presence of the stand. Due to the sheer darkness of the morning, I had contemplated turning the floodlights on when I first arrived, but was strictly forbidden from doing so until the stand was open. Without the floodlights on, and through the tinted glass, I could not see who was on the other side. I stood there staring at the window. Maybe it's just Dave, I rationalized to myself. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. The tapping had definitely grown louder. I picked up the business phone and punched in my boss's number, as he had an extensive camera system complete with night vision, and could see in real time both inside and outside the stand. At the very least, he could tell me who was outside. The phone rang and no answer, so I flipped on the floodlights, walked over to the window, and saw the man, now illuminated by the bright lights. His head was pressed up against the glass, hands cupped around his eyes as he tried to see in. I jumped back. "Hi," he yelled through the glass. "Can I get some coffee?" "We aren't open for another 15 minutes, I'm afraid, and my boss will be mad if I open early." "Oh well, I can wait." The man then walked away from the window and stepped back into a small black Honda. I continued my opening duties, warily eyeing the black Honda. At the time I felt a false sense of security, lulled into the daily routine of my shift. However, this was different. At 4:30 I dutifully turned on the open sign and watched as the man in the black Honda drove up to the window. He was wearing a dark red baseball cap, a thermal shirt, and plaid pajama pants. I opened the sliding window. "Hi, sorry about that. What can I get for you this morning?" I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. The man looked at me for what felt like an eternity. "What I want doesn't appear to be on the menu," he said, not looking up from my crotch. "Okay, so I know what you're thinking. What did I expect working in this profession? Gentlemen?" I brushed his comment aside with a laugh. "We have a great white chocolate mocha." I looked around frantically. Where the hell was the usual morning guy Dave? I silently prayed another customer would pull up behind this guy. He looked away and stared at his steering wheel. "I want you to be my maid." "Excuse me?" I said. not sure if I heard him correctly. "I want you to be my maid. I want you to come over to my house wearing a maid costume with nothing underneath. I want to watch you, and if you don't clean correctly, I'm going to do whatever I want to you." He paused and gripped his steering wheel tightly. I am not a nice guy. He looked up at me and smiled. Until that point in my life, I had never seen a truly sinister smile before. I slammed the long service window shut, ran to the back of the stand, hyperventilating at this point. I picked up the phone and called my boss repeatedly, with no answer, and I stood on the steps and peered out the window. The black Honda was gone, replaced with the familiar red of Dave's sports car. I never thought I would be happy to see pervy Dave, but here I was rushing to the service window to tell him what happened. I opened the window, all the while frantically relaying the story. Dave just laughed and muttered something about the guy dreaming. He told me I was being paranoid and the guy just had no filter. For some reason this put me at ease. Dave reached his hand out the window to place a $5 bill in my tip jar. He tipped this amount each morning. "Wow," he exclaimed, "you just opened and your tip jar is already full. I know you make coffee, but it's not that great." "Huh?" I said, slamming the register shut. The tip jar rested on the outside window ledge, so customers could reach it. I had made a habit of leaving it outside in between customers, as it could get very busy. I leaned over and looked into the metal canister. Inside the tip jar was a long white envelope that appeared to be stuffed into its capacity. My stomach turned, as I knew it would be from the guy in the black Honda. "Dave," I said cautiously, "it's from the guy I just told you about. I'm not opening that." Dave sipped his cappuccino and suddenly his goofy demeanor turned serious. "You're right. Let me open it. I have gloves." It was late fall and rather cold. Dave put on his gloves in a dramatic manner, laughed about my paranoia, and proceeded to step out of his car, and he took the envelope out of the tip jar and opened it. "Holy shit," he said, his eyes widening. He held up a stack of $20 bills held together by a rubber band. On the back of the stack was a folded up piece of paper. He unfolded the paper and began reading it. His eyes grew wilder. His hands were shaking ever so slightly. What does it say?" He simply said, "Get dressed and call the police." I snatched the note from him, his jaw slightly agape. The note was laden with spelling errors and looked like it had been written by a child. Oddly, there were rather long words that were attempted but spelt incorrectly. It said some very deranged things. There are some things too sick to mention here, but I will relay the basic message as best I can recall. Some things you just never forget, even if you want to. "You will come to my house. When you arrive, I will examine you thoroughly. And I will tie you to the post, and you will be punished for what you do. Every inch of your body will be bruised and sore. Afterwards, I will untie you and use you in every way possible." Just to mention, he used a different term, but it is extremely graphic and includes the word hogtied. "You can scream, but no one will hear you. This is your first payment. Upon reading this note and taking this money, you have agreed to follow through. If you do not follow through, you are stealing, and you will be punished more severely than if you cooperated to this initial agreement. You will clean every inch of my house. There will be no more mistakes, or more punishment will follow." I got dressed and called the police and my boss, who finally answered. The police arrived, and I went to the station to explain in detail what happened. I handed them the note along with the money for evidence. The female police officer nonchalantly told me I should probably quit my job, that this behavior was to be expected from their customers, and I told them that I had never experienced anything like this before. My boss reviewed the outside videotape footage, and the footage showed the man standing outside the coffee stand, just staring inside. Occasionally it showed him leaning his head into the glass and cupping his hands around his eyes for better view. It also showed him rubbing his crotch. Apparently he'd been standing outside since 3:40, 10 minutes after my initial arrival. At one point, it showed him going back into his car, to re-emerge several minutes later and finally tap on the window. I was shocked to realize that the man had watched me for almost a full hour without my knowledge. I felt stupid, but most of all scared. The footage also revealed that the man had his license plate covered with what appeared to be white paper. After reviewing the footage and the note, the police decided the man posed a potential threat, and that his behaviour was not normal. They sent an undercover cop back in the stand with me. I was shocked that they wanted me to go right back into work not even 2 hours after the incident. The cop sat outside in an SUV whilst I worked. The plan was this: if the man drove through again, I was to flick the open sign on and off to alert him of the man's presence. I worked serving all of my regular customers, trying my best to pretend nothing happened. I was told not to recall the incident to any one of my co-workers or customers that morning, in case they knew the man and warned him of police involvement. The man did not return that day, but he did return. Little did I know this would be the beginning of a year-long nightmare. The stalking continued for a while, roughly a year. The stalker left endless creepy gifts for me both at work and at my place of residence, all of which he signed off on as Turner. It got to the point where I couldn't prove it was him, because it would often be sent by a courier or a third party. He continued to come to the stand, and at one point he even promised to leave me alone. My co-worker was there, and we actually managed to have a very brief discussion in which he apologized and agreed that his behavior was inappropriate. However, he resumed just days later. The police were of no help, and kept insisting that it would all go away if I just quit my job. I had his license plates, and he was out of state, and vehicle description, but apparently the car wasn't even registered. Despite taking a leave of absence, the stalking continued. I didn't want to quit my job, as this was shortly after the recession. My mum, a sole provider for a family of 5, had lost her job, so I wanted to chip in and help her so that we wouldn't lose the house. Other bikini stands in the area were not hiring, due to being embroiled in prostitution scandals, all of which were heavily covered by the national media. You have no idea how hard it was, and maybe still is, to get a normal job after having worked as a bikini barista. Employers don't like it on your history all that much. The few of the scariest experiences included being assaulted at an ice freezer outside the coffee stand. Thankfully he didn't physically harm me, just grabbed and touched me inappropriately. Turner coming through the drive-thru completely naked and jacking off in a pair of women's underwear. Another incident occurred when my friend gave me a joint a customer had left me on her shift. Crazy it may sound, my regulars often left joints in my tip bar instead of money, as I liked to smoke a lot at the time. I asked my co-worker the customer's name, but she didn't get a chance to ask for it. I was told by my friend/co-worker that he had long hair and looked like a hippie, and this fit the description of a customer who would regularly leave joints in my tip jar. I smoked the joint before I went to sleep one night, only to have a massive freak-out full of hallucinations and hysteria. I thought I saw ghosts, demons and fire, and I ended up in the hospital. I found out in the hospital that, in addition to having marijuana in my system, I also had a bunch of PCP. Later on, Turner would take credit for this joint by sending a text to my phone, letting me know that if I wanted him to smoke me out, that we could get together sometime. I guess he thought that this weed was enjoyable. Of course, I gave his number to the police. I feel like I gave them enough information to get this guy. But I was never taken seriously, or they had bigger fish to fry. They did find out, however, that the phone he used was a burner. In this period of time, it was evident that one of my co-workers was sharing my personal information with Turner in exchange for money, or maybe just because she didn't like me. This co-worker was later arrested on prostitution charges, and I ended up relocating and changing my last name, which is surprisingly easy to do. I did this primarily to get away from Turner, but also so that I could get a fresh start with new employment history, and get away from the negative energy that had encircled my life. I had taken nude photos of myself and my boyfriend at the time, and after we broke up, he had leaked them to everyone on my contacts list, including my co-workers, and of course, this meant Turner most likely got a hold of the photos as well. It may seem strange to you, but after a while the stalking becomes part of your life. It's kind of like living around a bunch of rattlesnakes. You may feel constantly on guard and on edge, but eventually, you work your daily routine around trying your best to avoid the snakes so that you don't get bitten. When it happens, you do your best to move on. I've recently found out, within the last few months, that a man fitting my stalker's description was incarcerated some time ago for doing something even more frightening to another barista in the Pacific Northwest. There was also similar incidences and reports of a man driving through bikini stands naked, or with women's underwear. I suspect this man was most likely Turner. I cannot be sure it's the same person, as I never was able to find out this person's true first or last name, but I am hopeful that it's him, and that he will be locked away for a very long time. This happened when I was in high school in the 90s. I grew up in a rural western town. That meant not a lot to do, but lots of places out in the heavily wooded canyons and hills right outside of town. One particularly popular spot for hanging out, hiking, rock climbing and doing various other activities was called Falling Rock. It's right along the rim of Dark Canyon and features pine woods going from highway straight out to a sharp, abrupt drop-off down a sandstone/limestone cliff. It's several hundred feet down to the creek at the bottom, and there are various hiking trails and ways to get around the cliffs and down the creek. I went there frequently with friends in high school, not to smoke weed or drink or whatever, but because the place was also held as sacred by the Lakota, and by proximity, by teenage wannabe Wiccans like me. We'd see their red prayer bundles up in the cedars all along the cliffs, and to me and my coven of fellow dumbasses, that made this an obvious place to try and visit and contact spirits. I hiked it enough to become very familiar with the area, especially with a deep overhang that was almost like a shallow cave. It wasn't visible from the top of the cliff, or from the main hiking trails. I only learnt about it after someone showed me how to get to it by scooting down a steep incline between two particular pine trees on my butt. Also, during this very confused part of my life, I had a best friend who was an extremely bad influence, and who kept getting me involved with older guys. At 15, I lost my virginity to a 22-year-old guy in the Air Force that she had introduced me to, and then left me alone with. I won't say he made me do anything, but I also won't say I was entirely on board when everything happened. She later gave me away for a night to a Turkish guy who spoke no English. Then, she started seeing a guy in his early 20s. She was 18, and more or less told his 40-year-old something uncle that I was all his if he wanted. I was a 16-year-old dumbass. I didn't know about this scheme, I just knew that my best friend had just invited me up to Falling Rock, to hang out with her and her boyfriend. I was less happy when I showed up, and found the uncle there. I'd met him before, and he wasn't a dick or unattractive. Actually, he was quite attractive, or even especially creepy. It was just knowing he was more than twice my age, and very clearly wanted much more than the Air Force guy had. He didn't just want sex. He was in love with me, and wanted me to love him too. I knew it. I just didn't know what to do about it. But I did tell my friend I didn't want to see him around when she and I got together. She apparently ignored that bit of what I said. He and my best friend's boyfriend were both cowboys, following the rodeo circuit. As such, they showed up at Falling Rocks in their boots and hats and all of that. And it made them slow. My friend was morbidly obese, and none of them knew anything about Falling Rock, whereas I know the area very well. I had driven my own vehicle there, but had parked in the lower lot, about a quarter of a mile closer to the highway, than the place where they'd parked theirs. When I saw that their uncle was there, and he started getting overly friendly right away, I planned to get away as soon as possible. We started walking, and it wasn't before long that I got ahead of them and ignored their calls to come back and vanished into the woods down one of the less used hiking paths. This was broad daylight, and I had a plan. I was going to just loop around the northwest, through the thick woods, and come back up the lower parking lot, get into my car and drive away and let my friend explain why she'd brought the uncle later. I made good time and got back up towards the road to the main parking area where my friend and the uncle had parked. I was almost there when I saw another guy close to the uncle's age, but slimmer, blonde with a beard and a camouflage coat on, coming up from the trail in the parking area. We were a few hundred yards away from each other, but he stopped, clearly seeing me. I don't know what it was, but I didn't like something about his stance. His expression, I don't know what. I started to slink back down the draw I had come up, and he started to follow. No mistaking it. He turned off a well-worn obvious path to the falling rock cliff face to follow me, little teen-aged girl, down into nothing but deer trails and scrub and cacti. He didn't say anything all the while. It seemed like he was trying to be as quiet as possible. I knew the area better than he did though, and was a lot less cautious about my footing. I got back to the top of the cliff as quickly as I could, and popped up just ahead of where the uncle was sauntering along the edge, right next to where the big overhang would be. The uncle and I saw each other. I pointed back down the trail where the strange guy with the beard could clearly be heard stomping up behind me, and then I dropped down on my ass and boots scooted right out of sight. I got to the overhang and heard the exchange between the uncle and bearded guy. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" asks the uncle, sounding absolutely pissed. "I'm looking for my girlfriend. She just came up here. She's got dark hair." "Oh yeah? What colour shirt's she wearing?" I was wearing a grey hoodie with my dad's college logo on it. "It's a grey hoodie," said the bearded guy. The uncle proceeded to go absolutely batshit, yelling and cursing, and based on the noise, throwing fallen tree limbs on the other guy, and the other guy just ran. I could hear him thumping and crashing down the steep hillside not far from me. My friend's boyfriend kept running when he heard all the noise, and I could hear him yelling at the guy too. All kinds of vile shit you wouldn't think a good Christian boy would say. The uncle called my name for a bit, and I finally came out of the cave. And then, my fat friend finally joined us too. It was a weird day to have your sort of stalker save you from someone who seemed to really have it out for you, but I'm pretty sure that's just what he did. I wish I could say something better by him, but all I really did was disappear. I didn't talk to my friend for over a year, long enough for her to dump her boyfriend and for the uncle to go away with him. I don't know what happened to either of them. I don't know if I could recognize them now, as I'm twice the age I was then. I do wish them well though, but still, would rather not meet again. I worked in a dementia unit of a retirement home for a while, and I can tell you that it was by far one of the most interesting jobs I've ever had. It was sad in many ways, of course, but I think what some people don't understand is that we'd never known about our residents before the Alzheimer's or Lewy body or whatever. We just know and care for them as they are. Even some of the most advanced cases are able to demonstrate that they are unique individuals who enjoy life and need love and belonging like everyone else. That said, strange things happened every day. I'd say the strangest and most unnerving would be what happened with a resident that I will call Nancy. Nancy had very advanced Alzheimer's, to the point where we had not heard her say a word beyond incoherent mumbling for about 6 to 8 months. Every day, she would just pace the halls until it was time for bed, as pacing is a very common behaviour with moderate to advanced dementia. In Nancy's case, she pretty much never stops unless we made her come and eat something. We would commonly try to walk and talk with her, just to keep her stimulated, but she would hardly even look at us, just pace. Nancy had a husband that also lived in the community. This home had a section for dementia separate from a normal assisted living facility. Her husband Wayne lived in this other section. He would visit his wife every day until he himself became so sick he was confined to his room. When this happened, we started to grow worried. Even though it sometimes doesn't seem like it, frequent visitors make a big difference to even our most advanced cases. Nancy and Wayne had been married for over 60 years. It was undoubtable that even through her disease, Nancy still received some comfort through Wayne's visits. I suppose we need not have worried. Wayne died early one morning. We, as well as most dementia care units, have a policy that prohibits bringing negative energy where it would not do any good. So Nancy was not supposed to be told of Wayne's death. Later that day though, during her usual pacing, Nancy stopped, stared into the upper corner of the room for several minutes, and then all of a sudden started screaming. Now this isn't as alarming as it may seem. There was a lot of screams happening all the time in dementia units, but it made all the staff come to see what was wrong. She abruptly stopped screaming, and I swear by everything I hold dear, she started repeating her husband's name. Wayne, 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 over and over. Keep in mind she had not said the smallest word in almost a year. I got up to touch her on the arm and ask her gently if everything's okay. Nancy looked straight at me, which was also very abnormal for her, and she says, "He's bothering me. Tell him to leave me alone," then goes back to staring into the upper corner of the room. Half of the staff just nope out of there, whilst the rest of us tried to get her distracted by giving her a snack and a different activity. From that day on, she started talking again. Nothing lengthy, but she would occasionally start to talk to either us or herself. Many times she referenced someone called Grandpa, and started speaking to him in an otherwise empty room. While this isn't an uncommon thing for our residents to do, the fact that it did not start until the exact day her husband died still gives me serious creeps. An old guiding buddy of mine told me this story, and whilst I wasn't there myself, this happy-go-lucky hyper fella got really pale and quiet telling it. He would only tell it to me during the daytime after weeks of badgering, and it was the only time I saw him scared in all the months we spent leading a group around Appalachia. So, my buddy Mark went camping in a state forest in Virginia with a group of his college friends. They were a small group of 4 from the outdoor rec department, experienced kids with all the necessary gear in familiar terrain. Being college kids, however, they rolled into the campsite fairly late and decided to just car camp, which is camping near the car, no hiking in separate locations. It was early evening, but still just before the sun had set. As they were unloading the car and setting up camp, 2 mangy fellas came out the woods and approached them. These guys looked like they'd been living out there for quite some time and acted very strangely. They wouldn't look you in the eyes and just really twitched, and just seemed really twitchy, just kind of hanging around like they wanted something, like coyotes. My buddy Mark got an uncomfortable feeling right away. The guys introduced themselves. Now, nobody I've spoken to can remember the man's first name. It was something like Bill or Rick. But the second guy said his name was Gizmo. Funny, right? Hard to forget. So Gizmo and his friend began asking questions. Questions like, are you all going to stay the night? How much food do you have? When are you kids supposed to be heading home? You've all got phones, right? And are there any more of you planning on showing up? Well, Mark didn't like this one bit, so he started telling tales. Yeah, there's going to be 8 or 10 of us or more showing up tonight, and our parents expect us home first thing tomorrow morning. They're super paranoid, so we gotta get home on time or they'll call the cops. Parents, am I right? That sort of thing. Gizmo and company poked around camp a bit more, then wished the group good luck and disappeared back into the woods. Mark and his friends joked nervously about Gizmo and his friend, but weren't worried enough to actually leave. They built a fire and cooked dinner, then cleaned and hung up the bear bag. They spent the rest of the evening hanging out around the fire, chatting and drinking. One of them had a harmonica, I think, and by midnight they all turned in, and they had brought 2 tents, a girls' tent and a boys' tent. Well, Mark didn't feel right in the tent. He felt like somebody needed to keep watch, so he slept by the fire. Sometime later, Mark found himself awake. The fire was dying when he opened his eyes, and he couldn't see much beyond the campsite, except for one bright burning spot. There was a light out in the woods. It bobbed along at chest height, occasionally disappearing behind the trees, sometimes pausing. Whoever it was a good distance away, maybe 100 yards or so, and he followed it for a while until it went out. He stared into the darkness for a long time, until eventually he fell asleep once more. Suddenly Mark woke up again, this time in a panic. The fires were down to embers, barely glowing. He opened his eyes to see the strange light of the forest was back, and much closer now. He could see now it was from a lantern. He watched as the lantern carved a smooth perimeter around the campsite, occasionally going out, always reappearing a short distance away. Mark pretended to roll on his back in his sleep so that he could watch it. It circled the campsite twice, getting closer each time. The strange thing is, there were no sticks breaking, no leaves crunching. Somebody trapezing around the dark woods that close should have made a lot more noise. Whoever it was trying to be really quiet. Mark lay there, tense and unmoving. By the time it began its third rotation of the campsite, the lantern was so close that Mark could see a face illuminated on it. It looked like one of the fellas from earlier. He couldn't remember which one. His eyes were bugged out, scanning the campsite like a predator, and he was sweating. And then the lantern went out. At this point, Mark properly woke up. He got up and started making a lot of noise, stoking the fire, packing his gear. His watch read 4:30, and the sun wasn't up yet. He considered all of that happened, and made the tough call to wake his buddy and bug out. Nobody argued when they saw his face. Like I said, this guy's happy-go-lucky, and a human golden retriever, and an experienced woodman to boot. You'd believe him too. The sun was barely starting to come up, and by the time they got in the car, as they were driving out, they passed something that they hadn't noticed on their way in. There was an old RV parked out in the woods, camouflaged with a mixture of earth-colored tarps and actual greenery. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence that was also draped with camo tarps and leafy broads. The whole thing looked like a long-term hunting campsite. Mark and his friends were actually relieved. Gizmo and his friends must have been poachers, and that would explain their creepy stalking behavior. They had been trying to scare kids away from their campsite, Scooby-Doo style. Still cautious, they hightailed it out of there, and counted their lucky stars that they weren't deer. That should have been the end of the story. The next part I don't understand. I don't know why Mark or his friends didn't tell anyone about Gizmo for a few weeks. I would have thought for sure he'd report the poachers ASAP. He's very type A, and not typical for him to procrastinate, or let rule go unenforced. I don't know what his excuse was, but Gizmo and his pal were forgotten. Then one day, Mark mentions the incident to a law enforcement officer from the DNR that came to lecture at one of his classes. She asks casual questions, just to be polite, but then stiffens at the mention of the name Gizmo. "By any chance do you remember the other guy's name?" she asked. "No, it was something normal, but I don't remember." "God, they always say that," she replied. Turns out that part of this woman's job was investigating the murders that occurred in Virginia state forests. Most are body dumps for crimes that occurred elsewhere, but over the last decade a series of unsolved cases, stretching all the way into West Virginia, had targeted what appeared to be random unrelated campers. But when they interviewed other campings in the area around the time of the murders, they all mentioned the same uncanny details. They had all been approached by an individual named Gizmo, and another man who nobody's name they can seem to remember. This happened a while back. I was in college a couple of years ago. My roommate and I moved into a beautiful apartment our junior year of college. Our parents made it extremely clear that two small females living alone together was not ideal for some of the cheap, shady neighborhoods close to our college. We attended a college in our state capital, so we were in a city environment and had certain criteria we had to meet in order for us to live there and for them to co-sign our leases. Lit sidewalks, keyed entry into the apartment building, lit parking lots, and X amount of blocks from campus. So we finally found one that fit our parents' criteria. Our apartment building had a keyed entry for both the front of the building and the back gate that led to the fire escape. Our apartment was an end unit that led to the fire escape, so there were two deadbolt locks on it. We loved our apartment. We felt safe, we had fun, truly the college experience. And then my roommate's boyfriend started slowly moving his things into the apartment and stayed there more often than he should have. I finally tell my roommate if he wants to stay here and use the water, electricity and food I help pay for, then he needs to pay for it too, including our rent. I tell her a three-way split, or I'm paying only my rent and he can pay the entire electricity, water and trash bill. I think I'm being pretty fair, and even though her boyfriend doesn't have a job, that's not my problem. I work and go to college. Your "I don't want to work at McDonald's," yes he actually said that, excuse is completely garbage. If you want a place to stay, then to the Golden Arches you shall go, buddy. So instead, my roommate starts sneaking him in relatively late at night, after I go to bed, and he leaves on days I'm home. Whilst I'm in class, he's there, then leaves before I come back. My schedule is extremely routine. Well, he can't have a key, so if my roommate's in class or at work, how's he gonna get in? He can't take my roommate's key, because if he decides to leave halfway through the day, how will she get her key back? All good questions. The solution they come up with was to leave the back door unlocked. That leads to the fire escape, and that he can just jump the fence at the bottom of the fire escape to get back on the fire escape when he's ready to come back, or stick a rock between the door, whatever works for him. So I'm off work and school one Thursday morning and decide I'm going to sleep in for as long as I possibly can. My roommate and her boyfriend have already left for the day, so naturally they leave the door unlocked. I'm asleep like a pretty princess. It's about 10 in the morning when I hear the back door open to the apartment. I come to just enough to recognize the noise, realize that it's my roommate or her boyfriend, and I brush it off and try and drift back to sleep. All of a sudden, I start hearing someone creep through the apartment. It definitely doesn't sound like casual walking. It's clearly someone stepping slowly and quietly through the apartment. My door to the room is ajar, just a sliver, but I don't see anything out the door, and I'm honestly too tired to look up. A couple of minutes pass and I figure that my roommate and or her boyfriend are just being weirdos, and I fall back asleep. I can't be sure how much time passes before I open my eyes again, but it can't be too long. I wake up with my door opening. My back is to the door and I'm facing the opposite wall. I slowly start to turn over to see why my roommate or her boyfriend would dare wake me from my slumber. And there he is, a burglar, in my room, next to my bed I'm currently laying in. He's at least 6 foot tall and 250 pounds at least. Unplugging the TV, about 5 feet from where I currently am. I immediately pretend to just be shifting positions in my sleep, and continue to roll over with my eyes as shut as I could make them seem. Still open enough to watch what was going on though. He hears me shuffle as I turn over, and he looks dead at me, and luckily doesn't realise that my eyes are open just a tiny bit. He goes back to unplug my TV, my DVD player, and shoves it in a bag that he bought like the ones from IKEA, and steals my change jar, and casually starts walking out the front door of my apartment like he came in for a cup of tea. After I hear the door shut, I immediately spring out of bed, grab my phone, and start dialing 911, all the while locking the back and front doors. The dispatcher tries to calm me down. At this point I'm hysterical. I can't even catch my breath to tell her okay. Luckily, I told her my address before I started hyperventilating. Let me just take a moment to commend the police department in both the city and the college. They were there in under 3 minutes. She tells me the cops are there, but they'll need me to go downstairs to let them into the building because they don't have a key from the front door. I'm so afraid to open the door to my apartment, and even look down the hallway. I'm about to walk to the front door and extend my arm to the handle, when I hear, "Ma'am, it's the police," as if I didn't get scared enough already. They yell through the door. I am paranoid because the dispatcher just told me they couldn't get in, and I didn't realise someone probably let them in downstairs. I asked the dispatcher to confirm that people who are at my door are actually police officers, and she tells me that they are, and she confirms they're at my door. Okay, cool. I open the front door and I collapse right there. My legs completely turn into jello and I just hit the floor. I blacked out for a period of time, but they helped me sit me down on the couch. There's at least 10 officers in my apartment, both from the city and college. When I look outside the living room window on the street, there are 5 or 6 cop cars blocking the street, and I later found out they were doing a perimeter search of the entire area. I am being bombarded with questions. I have to try and find out what's missing beside the stuff in my room. I'm crying and shaking. This is not how I wanted my day to start off. I tell them my roommate left the back door open for her boyfriend, and they inspect the back door. The next thing I know, my roommate and her boyfriend both walk in having the most dumbfound look on their faces. At this point now, there is a detective talking to me, and I'm giving my statement, description of the burglar and the stuff missing, looking up mugshots, etc. I immediately stop talking to the detective, look up at both of them and blurted out, "Someone robbed us whilst I was asleep. He came into my room." My roommate looked at me dead in the face and says, "Oh my god, is any of my stuff gone?" And then I think, that's what you're asking me right now? If your replaceable shit is missing? 2 officers take her and her boyfriend aside and talk to them whilst I'm finishing up with the detective. I call my then boyfriend, and he comes over to help me pack my stuff, as I'm going to go stay over in his house for a couple of days, which turned out into staying until my lease at my place ended around 4 months. After failing to recognise any suspects in line, the cops slowly start leaving. After they leave, I call my parents and tell them what has happened, gather my things and head over to my boyfriend's. My roommate and her boyfriend never once apologised, not for leaving the door unlocked, but just in general, "I'm sorry this happened to you" kind of apology. They never asked if I was okay, if I wanted to talk, nothing. The day my lease ended was the best day of the entire year. I couldn't wait to get away from my roommate or her boyfriend and that apartment. They never found the guy who robbed me that day, and I don't even care about the material things. He robbed me of my safety and security, and it took a good amount of counselling to get that back. I'm also thankful he didn't try to attack me that morning. My friendship with my roommate was tarnished, and I haven't spoken to her since. To this day, I don't sleep with my back to the door, and I always have a knife under my mattress. 17 or 18 years ago, my fiancée, now wife of nearly 16 years, and myself, and one other couple were hiking the Pyramid Point hiking trail in the Sleeping Bear Dunes of northwestern Lower Peninsula of Michigan at dusk. We had my old film camera with a 200mm zoom lens on it. We got to the overlook, which looks northwest over the Manitou Passage to the Manitou Islands. We watched the sunset and entered that late dusk period that seems to last forever during a northern Michigan summer. It was probably 10 p.m. at this point. There were high winds and solid waves breaking on the shore below us. While standing and talking, we saw a light flash once out in the water between the islands and the mainland, in the vicinity of North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse. We stopped and looked, but weren't creeped out by it. After all, boaters are out in this stretch of water fairly regularly. I grabbed my camera and looked through the zoom lens, and I could make out what appeared to be a small boat, though it was difficult to tell with a 200mm lens, as it's a 7-mile wide stretch of water to the nearest island. So, we were probably 3 to 4 miles away from the actual light. We had flashlights, so we shined our lights in the direction of the light that we'd seen, waved it around, and immediately the light came back and started flashing SOS in Morse code, which was a huge surprise to us. We weren't even sure our lights were bright enough to be seen at that distance, and given the stretch of shore, it's almost all forested. We were just a little spot several miles away. We were suddenly full of adrenaline and concern. 2 of us ran back to the cars, which is half a mile through the woods in the dark down a hill with our flashlights, and got a cell phone and binoculars. While we were gone, the folks on the lookout had no light source. At the car, we called the Coast Guard from our cell phones. It was 1999, so these weren't smartphones by any stretch of imagination. We explained to the Coast Guard that someone was flashing SOS at us, out in the water, and that we were hikers, observing from Pyramid Point Overlook. They said that they would send a ship to look over the area, and we asked them to hurry. At this point, we ran back up to our overlook, with binoculars and phone and flashlight. Atop the overlook, there was no cell signal, so we had to pocket the phone, and had no further communications with the Coast Guard. With our binoculars, we were able to see a guy in an aluminium rowboat, rowing like crazy, with waves breaking over the bow of his boat. It was nearly pitch black outside, so we were only barely able to make this out. It was about 10:30 or 45 at this point. During Michigan summer, it's still light enough to see outside. But anyway, he would occasionally turn around and flash SOS at us, and go back to rowing. It was disturbing to be several miles away, completely helpless, whilst we watched this guy struggling in a rowboat in the dark. It got dark, and we could not see anything anymore, but every few minutes the man in the boat would flash SOS. He did not appear to be making any progress towards the mainland, but he was clearly drifting northwestwards through the Manitou Passage. Every time he flashed, we'd turn on our flashlight and shine it back at him for a few seconds, and turn it off. We did not know Morse code, and had no cell signal. We stood and watched for what seemed like forever, completely helpless. The man stopped flashing his light, and it was too dark to see his boat. And then a tugboat appeared, that did not appear to be the Coast Guard ship, showed up and started doing a grid search pattern through the passage, with bright lights shining from around the water. The Manitou Passage is probably 6 to 7 miles wide, and 6 to 7 miles long, so it was a slow search, and a smallish Coast Guard ship started doing searches at the northern end of the straits, also with bright lights. They met in the middle of the straits, having done a zigzag-type pattern for what felt like an eternity, then sailed off. They didn't find anyone. We drove into a bar in Glen Arbor to see if there was anything on the news, and there wasn't. We called the Coast Guard the next morning, wondering if we'd seen a man die or helped to rescue. But the person on duty had no idea what happened, or that we'd even called the night before. So to this day, it's unsettling to me, knowing how harsh the conditions on Lake Michigan can be, and knowing that we'd seen a man flashing SOS at us through our binoculars just before it got dark was really bothersome. There's no closure, no happy or sad ending, no ending at all, other than going back to our camp and hitting the sack. I have no idea what happened to him, and I really doubt I ever will. I have a couple of creepy experiences that I can share from my 3rd year of medical school, which is when everything is still new to you, when you have no idea what to expect or how to handle some of the stuff. So, psych rotation at the State Mental Hospital. We went in to evaluate a middle-aged woman with a history of visual hallucinations and erratic behaviour. Through most of the interview, she looked at the floor and responded slowly with one-word answers. Very flat effect and clearly schizophrenic, but not really endorsing any of the symptoms that brought her to the hospital. All of a sudden, I'm thanking her for her time and about to leave the room. She jumps up and grabs the lapels of my white coat, surprisingly hard, and pulls, and gets right up into my face, close enough for her breath to fog my glasses. I didn't say a word. I just had the most intense look of fear on my face, and she just stared right at me, breathing hard. I froze. I didn't know whether to push her away or to say anything, and I had no idea what she was going to do. It lasted maybe 4 seconds, before other staff came to help, but those few seconds were absolutely terrifying. This following incident happened at hepatology rotation, which for non-medical folk is the liver disease service, mostly alcoholics with cirrhosis. Cirrhosis is a rough disease and is eventually fatal without a transplant. Alcoholics tend to not qualify for transplants in general because most of them won't stop drinking and don't have adequate social support and are too deconditioned to do well after the transplant, and we only want to give our short supply of organs to those who will get the most medical benefit. You don't want an alcoholic to get organs, keep drinking, and not get out of bed after the surgery, only to die next year anyway, or scar up the next liver from alcohol abuse. So anyway, most of the patients I saw were in that situation, with bad symptoms and no hope for a transplant. Most of them had severe hepatic encephalopathy as well, which is delirium and confusion because of basic metabolic toxin waste that builds up and affects the brain because the liver can no longer get rid of it. I remember one patient who was really out of it, couldn't even get words out, just grunts and moans. He didn't have long left, and the family had just decided to stop treating the disease and make him as comfortable as he could so that he could die at home in peace. I walked in that morning to stop and get some meds, get him ready and send him home to do my physical discharge, and he's sitting up and eating a bowl of cereal looking lucid. It surprised the hell out of me. He normally couldn't control his movements at all. No way this guy could manage to eat cereal or hold a spoon. I cautiously asked how he was doing today, I hadn't heard him utter a word the whole month he'd been there. He'd been on my service, and he said, "I'm dying soon. I haven't got a lot of time." My jaw about hit the floor. Then he was out of it again. He dropped the spoon and spilt the cereal all over himself. I figured the lucidity was some sort of freak occurrence, and I went to the bedside to examine him. Halfway through the exam, he stops groaning and looks lucid again and says, "Well, I'm out of here," and then immediately slumps back into a V-fib arrest. I think about that moment every time I have a dying delirious patient. I'm always half expecting some crazy moment where they become lucid and call their own death like that. I always wonder how he knew, or what feeling he had to make him say that. This was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when I was 20, and in a really bad way. I had been screwing up my life via heroin for the past year. But after a lot of help, love and luck from friends and family, finally, I was getting my head cleared, and was almost there, above the black tar hell I had gotten myself into. I decided to get out of the city, and drove 2 hours out to a smaller town in Missouri, where Google Maps told me a small campsite by water was. I knew that there shouldn't be very many campers, because it had just gotten cold and was around 40 or so that night. Nearly there, as I'm driving down a misty morning road, just a picturesque straight 2-line highway. There's this object laying in the road about half a mile up. I slow my approach and can see this shaggy mutt just hanging out. I stop and rolled down my window right next to it, and she came up, licked my hand and wagged her tail a bit. She seemed to expect something of me. She had no tag, no tattoo for Chip, and was just a dog with no name. Naturally, I popped open the passenger side door for her, and she was so glad and hopped in. So now I've got this dirty but friendly companion with me for my little excursion, the dog with no name. The entrance to the campsite was only a half-mile further. As I suspected, there was no one around. I just dropped a 5 in the honor box and picked the closest site to the stream. I set up my tent, the same one I did set up for years with my dad as a kid, collected some dry sticks, and started a fire. The dog with no name just circled the campsite, looking content enough to sniff some leaves and roll around in the mud. I went to check out the rivulet, about 30 feet wide. It had a man-made stone dam that you could walk across. To the west was the deeper part of the river, sort of pooling at the dam, then maybe an 8-foot drop to the east into calmer streams. Instantly, I wanted to go on, cleanse myself, symbolize, baptize, whatever. I grew up Catholic, so that kind of shit runs through my head to this day, though I'm far from religious. The dog sees me scoping out the whole time from the campsite. I can't bring myself to do it though. I'm hugely disappointed in myself. But it's cold, it's brackish, and I don't have a towel. So I go back up to smoke some cigarettes, eat hot dogs, and pet the dog with no name. Night falls quickly after all this meditation, and I roll inside the tent to sleep. My buddy sleeps inside the tent, next to the sleeping bag. This dog was awesome. And I wake up in the middle of the night for no reason. I can't put my finger on it. And my main source of warmth, the dog with no name, is missing. I slide out the tent, as I assume I left it unzipped, and there she is, just sitting there waiting for me in the pitch black, wagging her tail. I feel very strange, like something is happening here, and someone/something is telling me to get back down to the river and do the damn thing. We walk down the short trail together, surrounded by Missouri black. It's even colder than before, but I start to strip anyway, standing on the chilly stones of the dam. The dog with no name sits on the edge of the river again, just watching me, a slight wag. I'm now stark naked as can be, staring into this black pool that looks like supernatural ink. I should mention here that I hate swimming in the water. I can't see the bottom of it, and my fearful imagination takes over and I freak out. In other words, I stand naked on the dam for over 10 minutes before I finally mustered up the balls and just dive into the blackness. It was cold as hell and scary as shit. When I came up for air, I was thrashing wildly back towards the dam, scrambling back onto the slick stones. I shook out my hair and was surprised how the adrenaline helped me keep warm. As I was picking up my shoes and clothes, I looked over for my body at the river's edge. The dog with no name was nowhere in sight. Back up the campsite, I look around gently whistling and that kind of thing. I'm more than woken up by now, so I go ahead and start another fire as dawn is just starting to break. I have another hot dog for breakfast and figure I might as well pack up and leave. This trip feels more than complete. I start my car up and check my phone. There is an hour time difference between the two. This happens to fall on daylight savings time. I'm not calling it a supernatural rip in time, but it's funny it was the night this went down. In fact, the exact time would have been around 3 or 4 AM that the dog disappeared. So the dog never showed up again, and I never shot heroin again. This was quite easily the closest I've ever been to cardiac arrest, and considered some of the professions I've had, that's saying a bit. In mid-2004, I became newly separated from my wife, and decided a getaway and career change were in order. Call it a geographical cure if you will, but that's a story for another time. I decided to move a couple of thousand miles from my home to attend a quick 4-month continuing education course in industrial radiography and ultrasonics in Calgary, Alberta. I'd fared well in the course, and due to the oil boom happening in North America at the time, I was literally hired by a large company waiting outside the doors as we graduated from our educational endeavours. Taking the job entailed moving a further 800 miles into the north of Canada, to be based out of a small town which serviced the surrounding oil fields. I had no idea what the place would be like, and what I'd be in store for. At the time, the north of the Canada prairies had taken all of the influx of workers that it could, and infrastructure really didn't grow with the boom. Trying to find a place to live up there was next to impossible. I am not at all stretching the truth when I say that people were renting their balconies for people to pitch a tent on a couple of places. I kid you not. Some of the places that ended up being rented weren't even fit for human habitation. This was the Black Gold Rush. I overstayed my company chit in a hotel that they put me up for a month, and was told that I had to find a place to live. It was absolutely next to impossible to find accommodations for a few reasons. I was working between 12 to 20 hour days, and the vacancy rate was somewhere less than 0. I had decided to look at some outlying communities. I asked for a day off, and ended up driving about an hour from our office and found a small farming community. I used the word community loosely. This was a spattering of easily 60 to 100-year-old dilapidated houses, centered around a greasy main street. The liquor store doubled as a post office, bar doubled as a hotel, and the grocery store looked and smelled of a slaughterhouse that could have been condemned. Wild West shit. I drove by an old house that had been obviously divided into several apartments, and almost couldn't believe my eyes when I saw the orange and black for rent sign screaming out at me. My heart did sink a bit. The place was clapboard, and the kind of dirty that you see before you even get out of your truck. At this point, after about a month of brutality on the pipelines of Alberta, I was exhausted and simply didn't care. It was irony abound. I was making wicked money and could afford to get an uptown place. But because of the boom, I was going to be forced to live in a ditch. Great. But I digress. I ended up taking an apartment in this building. That's an abuse of the word apartment. This was a dive beyond dives. They say that Alberta is rat-free, but I can testify the statement is a crock of shit. And I don't mean just the variety of rodentia. The people living in this building could easily have qualified as something that had crawled from the oil and grease-laden hulls of a ship, straight up to the steps and into a pile of meth on a cheap kitchen table. The place itself was enough that I could easily have said, let's not meet. Carpets that were once grey were now an indescribable clay colour. Dirt rubbed into dirt, into the sail-off tint paint, carelessly rubbed all over the place, with a $1 brush. And the smell. The smell of unwashed hair wrapped around rotten vegetables that might have been thrown into a wet paper bag, and at that point you're getting somewhere close. After sighing loudly and handing $2,000 to the landlord in cash, I took the place. I didn't have a choice. Besides being exhausted, I knew I wouldn't get another day off, and I was right. I worked from July to December 24th without a day off. Barring the day, I procured my glorious abode. I had arranged beforehand to get a bed from Sears that morning, and I had it in the back of my truck. I dragged the queen mattress across the barroom of the kitchen floor and into a place that had been divided off by 16th-inch wood panels into a bedroom. For the next 9 months, this would be my home. If the grubby kitchen table and one chair that was sitting in place wouldn't have been included, the only thing in place would have been that bed. That would be it. Except for my alarm clock on the floor. I get up at 4 AM, drive, work like a coal miner until sunset, drive, drink whiskey, drop on bed in overalls, and rinse and repeat for 100 days. Literally. Then one Friday in October, I come home after a particularly brutal day of dragging my arse through the mud. My feet finally hit the kitchen floor at around 11 at night, and I was in a mood. I sat down at that pissant kitchen table in my fire-retardant coveralls, covered in mud past my waist. You probably have never worked those kind of hours or those kind of conditions, but after a while you stop caring just about anything. I sat there and downed about half a pint of whiskey in a quarter pint of time, and smoked cigarette after cigarette. Lit each one of the bastards, with the last one I'd smoked. I knew I was in trouble with the drinking and smoking, but as with most things, I didn't care. I'd become married again, married to work, married to the mud, married to the oil, married to the welding, the pipe, and married to the hours that turned me as dirty as the place I inhabited. After I'd finished hating my body for another hour, I noticed it was past midnight, and I knew I'd had to be up in 6 hours. That was considered my day off up there, not starting work until 8 AM on the weekends. I crashed down on my bed, coveralls still wrapped around my waist, commando underneath. The rust scraper I carried to remove scale from welds before I x-rayed them, still in my side pocket. I reached over and clicked the alarm button with a sigh. I remember thinking that I was pretty sure that none of this was worth the money. I was a shell of a human being. In those days, I'd often drift in and out of consciousness whilst trying to sleep. I'd be buzzed, overtired, and really just resting until the next onslaught of 100 welds. I remember that night hearing a fair amount of scratching in the kitchen, just past the partition that made my door into my room. At one point, I think I took exception to it and grumbled a bit. The mice, rats and roaches were louder than usual. Who knew what the crackheads were doing next door that night? Then I remember drifting off into a numbled, half-dreaming state. The scratching had stopped. I hadn't been laid in months, and started in a semi-dream about a woman I'd seen at a gas station in one of the nameless towns we'd passed through as the crew. Then I saw her shadowy form at the foot of my bed, and I smiled. Then, as the eyes slowly registered half open, I realized I was no longer dreaming, and that wasn't her, and that he was breathing loudly. He was standing at the foot of my bed, and I froze in terror for what seemed like 15 seconds. He grabbed my foot. "Lisa," he breathed out at me in a slurred, throaty pitch that brought me in with the smell of chemicals that managed to overshadow both the whiskey on my breath and the hovel smell that was the atmosphere I lived in. Now, I'm not a huge guy, but when I get all kind of freaked out, I'm fairly strong. I remember not even thinking, just reacting. I pulled the scraper from my side pocket and launched myself, rolling sideways off the bed, wrenching my foot from his grip. I don't think I'd even hit the ground before I was on my feet and swung hard. I not only felt skull when that scraper connected with the front of his head, I heard it scrape across that shadow. The next blur would have been comedic relief had the situation not been what it was. He howled in pain, and almost in a hurt feelings kind of way. Because I was still half drunk, and had launched myself at him like a linebacker practicing on the full height tackle, my head went straight into the goddamn wall near the edge of my door, and sent me back straight onto the bed. I hit very hard whilst hyperly intelligently yelling, "Gah!" I remember the sound of my scraper hitting the kitchen floor with a shitty sounding clang, and I remember the bright flash as I fell backwards, and right before I'd lost consciousness, I remember thinking, "Oh shit, he's got me." I passed out. When I came to it, I don't really know how much time had passed. I came back slowly, but as soon as I remember what was going on, I made an attempt to leap back onto my feet, and dizzy as a dog that's been beaten. I fell sideways onto my left arm, and I felt it crunch underneath my weight. I remember screaming, "Shit, shit," as loudly as I could, before I got back up and charged into the kitchen. I slammed the heels of my hands into the wall where the light switch was, flooding the greasy yellow light over the mess that was my kitchen. The front door was wide open. I was standing in blood, and no one was there. I remember hearing scurrying behind the door across the hallway from me, like someone was trying to figure out what was going on in the cacophony that was my shithole apartment. I had a few lengths of pipe in the kitchen. They were 2 to 4 inch pieces of pipe cutouts, butt welded together as test welds. I brought them home as examples of weld defects to study. I grabbed a 2-inch diameter sample of pipe that was about 3 feet long and ran at my front door. No one there. I don't really know how long I was in the bedroom for, but as the realization that the intruder had fled crept onto me, so did the adrenaline leave me. I began shaking, dropped the pipe, and sat down on the floor right in my doorway. The chick who was living across the hall opened the door and asked me if I was okay. I sat there bare-chested, with muddy coveralls up to my waist, curly hair turned into Jimi Hendrix on a bad night, with blood from my forehead running across my face, and I'm sure I absolutely stunk, and stunk of the whiskey that had screwed me into the doorway. It was probably a classic YouTube moment, as I, Jack Nicholson, looked up at her with my pointy eyebrows and sarcastically drawled out at her, "Does it look like I'm okay?" She slowly closed her door, and probably figured I was another oil-filled crackhead who'd gone off the rails for another holiday. What I saw then really bothered me, almost more than the intrusion. The entire outer frame had been removed from the outside of my entrance door. The guy had worked hard to get in there. He wanted in. He wanted in quietly, and whoever Lisa was, I'm certain that he hadn't intended much good. Oddly, I remember feeling more nauseous about whoever he was going to rape or do God knows what to, than about the actual intrusion. I stood up, closed the door, and picked up the overturned kitchen chair, plunking it down. Then I almost puked across the kitchen table, and whatever drunk there was left in me suddenly dissipated. For only one of a few times in my life, I was genuinely frightened, and I do not frighten easily. I remember waiting a while before I called the cops. At that time, the RCMP were often few in number and overworked in those remote areas. They never even showed up until hours later, explaining that, since I told them that he was no longer there, they felt it safe. Later, when I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, face bloodied, left arm screaming in pain, someone else's blood on my hands, I remember wiping my hand across the mirror to try and get some of the gunge off the glass. I sat there and stared at the blood I left on the mirror for a good 10 minutes, and decided that my time in the town was over. I called my boss when the sun came up, and told him he'd either be putting me back in a hotel, or I was driving south, and he could hire whoever deranged goddamn crackhead he wanted. He agreed after I explained the night, and so came the end of my tenure at Hines Creek. So, you meth-head son of a bitch, let's not meet. Not in the dark, not in the middle of the night whilst I'm sleeping anyway. But by all means, come on by when I'm awake. Lock your doors at night. Call the police when you should, especially if you're a woman. And take this kind of stuff seriously. When I was young, my dad lived in an old log cabin about 15 miles west of Sheridan, Wyoming, in the foothills of Bighorn Mountain. Every summer when I was visiting, we would go up to the mountains backpacking and fishing for 2 days every weekend. We would park the truck, hike into a remote area, fishing for trout along the way, and make camp wherever we ended up. We encountered a number of strange and creepy things, and got into some scary situations with wildlife. But the situation that sticks out with me the most was an ancient abandoned camp we found. We were hiking down a very steep slope to get to an area of a creek that had been dammed up by beavers, hoping to catch some big trout. I had climbed out on a rock ledge and was looking for a way down when I saw the stop and action of an old rusty rifle sticking out of a tree, where the tree had grown around the barrel for years before. It was around 10 feet above the ground. Dad and I climbed down to check it out, and we found a small cave at the base of the rock, a formation only about 12 inches deep, which would make a nice natural shelter, but a really terrible place to set up a long-term camp. Inside we found a bunch of really old stuff. 3 heavy gauge unopened cans of food, an old cast iron pot that had holes rusted in all the way through, a crusty old saddle and bridle set, a very deteriorated heavy woolen blanket rolled up and tied with a leather belt. When we unwrapped the blanket, we found several personal items, including a rusty old cap, and ball black powder revolver, a leather satchel with a lead pistol shot, and a powder horn with no black powder in it, tarnished old cartridges, presumably for the rifle in the tree, a straight razor, and most unsettling of all, was a shirt with holes in it, and over half of it stained with dried blood. As we stood there thinking about what all of this meant, it occurred to me how remote this place was, even at the time of July 1985, and the fact that whoever owned that shirt had been very seriously injured. Stuck on a steep slope in the middle of absolutely nowhere, I got serious chills down my spine. The only thing that somewhat dated this fateful campsite was the pistol and the rifle, both of which were made sometime in the 1870s according to my father. There's no way to ever know what happened to the man who owned all this stuff. But the fact that he, or someone he knew, obviously shot twice with either a gun or arrow, and all of his belongings were sitting right there where he left them possibly 100 years later, it was highly unlikely that he left the area alive. Discovering what amounts to an 100-year-old crime scene in this very remote wilderness kinda gave me the creeps, but mostly, it just made me sad to know how hopeless and alone this guy must have felt when he died. I asked my dad if I could keep the pistol, and he simply said, "It's not mine to give, and we're not thieves." He chose instead to teach me a lesson about respecting the dead and preserving history. He had been very careful inspecting everything, and we put everything back exactly as we had found it. My dad then told me to take my hat off and observe a moment of silence and reflection as a sign of respect for the man who most likely lost his life on that mountain. Then we went fishing. I tried several times over the years to find that spot again, especially now that I have sons of my own, but sadly, I've never been able to find it. I am a former critical care and ED nurse. The two stories, both of which occurred at a large Houston hospital in the mid-1980s. This is my first story. The emergency services bringing a young man about 25. He is in a decerebrate posture, stiff hands and partial fists, which turned out indicating deep brain damage, and being manually bagged. As he came in the door, he was not intubated. According to the emergency services, his significant other had found him in bed with another woman, either drunk or deeply asleep. She carried a .25 caliber pistol with her, and the reports was that she placed the weapon directly against the patient's skull and pumped around 10 rounds into his brain from various angles. The rounds were powerful enough to enter the skull and bounce around, but not to exit. All higher brain function was destroyed, but automatic functions remained. We intubated him, or inserted him into a breathing tube, and placed him on one of those old Barney Bear ventilators. Very primitive by today's standards. This caused the patient to buck, to fight against the ventilator with deep coughs. When he did so, the pressure within his head increased, and little fountains of brain matter would be expelled from the 10 holes in his skull. One hit me in the face. I was pretty well protected by clinical distance at the time, but I must admit this really got to me. There was nothing really that could be done for him, other than supportive care, and he died a few weeks later from a massive infection. The other story I have is about another young man that agreed to be mummified in a rather extreme sexual practice. Essentially, he was placed in a full-body plaster, covering even his face, and was given breathing tubes through the cast. Other than that, he was fully encased in the cast with the exception of his toes and genital/anal area. My understanding was that this extreme degree of helplessness was considered erotic. The normal practice was to use a cattle prod or some similar device rectally to force ejaculation, but in this case, either through ignorance or malice, he was directly connected to 220 volts with one probe in his rectum and the other probe on his foot. He had third-degree burns all over his entire genital and perianal area, deep burns on his foot, and the smell, severe burns everywhere. Blood, feces and serious fluid was leaking from what had once been his rectum. We tried to remove the cast to see if any degree of rescue were possible, but by the time it was even partially off, it was clear he was quite dead. All of us just stood there with our mouths open, utterly unable to say anything. The police that came there too were mute. I volunteered to remove the entire cast and rendered some level of post-mortem. I found deep lacerations over much of his body, deep bruising, and quite a few other burns. We sent the body to the medical examiner, and I spent the rest of the shift trembling and vomiting.